Between 1889 and 1906, exactly 201 parishioners from St. Bartholomew's Abbey in rural Vermont disappeared without a trace, their names systematically erased from church records. The disappearances followed a pattern: families who questioned the Abbey's increasingly strict doctrines, individuals who missed mandatory confessions, and children who displayed what Father Matthias called unholy curiosity. Local authorities received no missing person reports because the Abbey maintained its own civil records. When federal investigators finally arrived in 1907, they found underground chambers beneath the sanctuary filled with personal belongings, hair samples stored in glass vials, and detailed psychological profiles of every vanished soul. St. Bartholomew's Abbey stood as Vermont's most revered religious institution for nearly 3 decades. Established in 1874 by Father Matthias Blackwood, a charismatic Benedictine monk from England, the Abbey attracted families seeking spiritual refuge from the rapid industrialization sweeping through New England. Father Blackwood arrived in Millfield Valley with impeccable credentials. He carried letters of recommendation from Canterbury Cathedral and spoke 7 languages fluently. His theological dissertations on spiritual purification had been published in London and Rome. The local Protestant community initially viewed the Catholic presence with suspicion, but Blackwood's charitable works quickly won their respect. The Abbey's construction began immediately. Blackwood personally supervised every detail, from the Gothic architecture to the imported stained glass windows depicting scenes of martyrdom. Local craftsmen praised his attention to detail and generous payment. The finished structure rose 3 stories above ground, with a bell tower visible for miles across the valley. What made St. Bartholomew's unique was its comprehensive approach to community life. Unlike traditional parishes, the Abbey offered housing for families, educational programs for children, and employment opportunities in its extensive farmlands. Father Blackwood preached that true salvation required separation from worldly corruption. By 1880, nearly 400 souls called the Abbey home. Families lived in modest cottages surrounding the main structure. Children attended the Abbey school, where they learned Latin, theology, and practical skills. Adults worked the fields, tended livestock, or crafted goods sold in nearby towns. The community appeared self-sufficient and harmonious. Father Blackwood's sermons drew visitors from across New England. His powerful oratory combined traditional Catholic doctrine with personal revelations he claimed to receive through intensive prayer and fasting. He spoke of spiritual warfare between good and evil, emphasizing the need for absolute obedience to divine authority. The abbot established strict daily schedules for all residents. Morning prayers began at 5 o'clock, followed by communal breakfast and work assignments. Lunch included brief theological instruction. Evening prayers lasted 2 hours, often extending until midnight during special observances. Father Blackwood personally monitored attendance at all religious functions. Local newspapers regularly featured positive stories about the Abbey. The Millfield Gazette praised the community's agricultural innovations and charitable contributions to surrounding towns. When drought struck the region in 1882, the Abbey provided grain to struggling families. During a scarlet fever outbreak in 1883, Abbey members nursed the sick without compensation. Father Blackwood cultivated relationships with influential figures throughout Vermont. Governor John L. Barstow visited the Abbey in 1884, praising its educational programs. State Senator William Morris invested heavily in Abbey agricultural ventures. The Burlington Free Press described Father Blackwood as a beacon of moral leadership in troubled times. The Abbey's financial success impressed observers. Despite accepting families regardless of their economic status, the community prospered. Father Blackwood claimed divine providence guided their fortune, but careful management and diversified income sources explained their stability. They sold dairy products, crafted furniture, and operated a successful printing press. Medical care at the Abbey exceeded standards found in most rural communities. Dr. Samuel Winthrop, a licensed physician from Boston, established a clinic serving both residents and neighboring families. The Abbey maintained detailed health records and implemented sanitation practices ahead of contemporary medical knowledge. Education received particular emphasis under Father Blackwood's leadership. The Abbey School employed 5 teachers, including 2 with university degrees. Students learned reading, writing, mathematics, sciences, and multiple languages. Many graduates continued their education at prestigious institutions, bringing honor to the Abbey's reputation. The community's children appeared remarkably well-behaved and intelligent. Visitors often commented on their polite manners and extensive knowledge of Scripture. Father Blackwood took personal interest in their development, conducting individual interviews to assess their spiritual progress and intellectual capabilities. Women at the Abbey enjoyed greater freedoms than typically allowed in Victorian society. They participated in theological discussions, managed community finances, and taught in the school. Sister Catherine Morrison, Father Blackwood's deputy, delivered sermons when he travelled. This progressive approach attracted educated women seeking spiritual fulfillment. The Abbey's agricultural innovations earned recognition from state agricultural societies. They pioneered crop rotation techniques, developed hybrid livestock breeds, and constructed advanced irrigation systems. Their methods increased yields while maintaining soil fertility, leading neighboring farmers to adopt similar practices. Father Blackwood's personal library contained over 3,000 volumes, including rare theological texts and scientific works. He encouraged residents to pursue intellectual growth alongside spiritual development. Regular lectures covered topics ranging from astronomy to philosophy, demonstrating the Abbey's commitment to comprehensive education. Religious festivals at St. Bartholomew's attracted hundreds of visitors annually. The Feast of Saints celebration featured elaborate processions, traditional music, and communal meals. These events showcased the community's devotion while generating significant revenue from donations and craft sales. The Abbey maintained correspondence with religious institutions worldwide. Father Blackwood exchanged letters with monasteries in Europe, theological seminaries in America, and missionary organizations in developing countries. This international network enhanced the Abbey's prestige and provided access to advanced religious scholarship. Local authorities rarely intervened in Abbey affairs. The community managed its own disputes through religious counseling and peer mediation. Crime rates remained virtually non-existent, eliminating the need for regular police presence. This self-governance impressed state officials and reinforced public confidence in Father Blackwood's leadership. Professional guilds recognized Abbey craftsmen for their exceptional skills. Furniture makers, metal workers, and textile producers created goods rivaling urban manufacturers. Their reputation for quality workmanship and honest business practices extended the Abbey's influence throughout New England's commercial networks. The Abbey's printing press published religious materials, educational texts, and community newsletters. Father Blackwood authored several devotional books that gained popularity among Catholic readers. Publishing revenues supplemented agricultural income and funded expansion projects. Medical students from nearby universities sought internships at the Abbey Clinic. Dr. Winthrop's innovative treatments and detailed case studies contributed to medical literature. The clinic's success rate in treating various ailments exceeded regional averages, further enhancing the Abbey's reputation for comprehensive care. By 1888, St. Bartholomew's Abbey represented the pinnacle of religious community achievement. Visitors described it as heaven on earth and a model for Christian living. Father Blackwood's vision had created what many considered the perfect fusion of spiritual devotion, intellectual growth, and practical prosperity. None suspected the darkness that would soon consume this apparent paradise. The first disappearance occurred during the harsh winter of 1889. Thomas Henderson, a widowed farmer with 3 young children, failed to appear for morning prayers on February 14th. His cottage stood empty, with breakfast still warm on the table. Personal belongings remained untouched, but Thomas and his children had vanished without explanation. Father Blackwood addressed the community that evening with characteristic calm. He explained that Thomas had received a divine calling to missionary work in distant lands. The family's sudden departure, though painful, demonstrated their commitment to God's will. When asked about Thomas's failure to bid farewell, Father Blackwood cited the urgency of divine commands. Sister Catherine Morrison recorded the explanation in community logs. Thomas Henderson and his children departed February 14, 1889, for missionary service in South America. The entry appeared routine, matching similar records for families who had genuinely left for evangelical. No one questioned the documentation's accuracy or Father Blackwood's divine revelation. Margaret Sullivan, Thomas's neighbor, expressed private doubts about the disappearance. She had spoken with Thomas the previous evening about his plans to repair his cottage roof come spring. He had shown no indication of departure plans or religious calling. Margaret shared her concerns with other residents, but found little support for her suspicion. 3 weeks later, the Brennan family disappeared under similar circumstances. Patrick Brennan, his wife Mary, and their twin daughters vanished overnight. Their cottage showed signs of interrupted activity, half-finished sewing projects, banking records spread across the kitchen table, and Patrick's carpentry tools arranged for the next day's work. Father Blackwood's explanation followed the same pattern. The Brennans had received urgent calling to establish a new religious community in the Western Territories. Their expertise in construction and domestic management made them ideal pioneers for expanding God's kingdom. The community accepted this explanation with minimal questioning. Dr. Samuel Winthrop noticed disturbing patterns in the disappeared family's medical records. Both Thomas Henderson and Patrick Brennan had recently requested copies of their children's health documentation. Mary Brennan had inquired about transferring medical records to another physician. These actions suggested planned departure, contradicting the spontaneous nature of their supposed divine callings. The doctor approached Father Blackwood with his observations. The abbot listened patiently before explaining that God often prepared hearts for service through subtle promptings. The family's practical preparations demonstrated divine wisdom working through human planning. Dr. Winthrop accepted this explanation, but privately documented his concerns. Spring brought additional disappearances. The McCarthy family, known for their skeptical questions during theology classes, vanished in April. The O'Brien sisters, who had expressed interest in visiting relatives in Boston, disappeared in May. Each incident followed identical patterns: overnight departure, personal belongings left behind, and Father Blackwood's explanations of divine calling. Sister Catherine's record-keeping became increasingly important as disappearances continued. She maintained detailed logs of community population, tracking arrivals and departures with bureaucratic precision. Her records showed consistent outflow of families answering missionary calls, but no corresponding communication from these supposed missionaries in the field. Local postal workers noticed the Abbey's correspondence patterns changing. Previously, the community maintained regular communication with former residents who had left for legitimate reasons. Beginning in 1889, outgoing mail decreased significantly, while incoming letters dwindled to practically nothing. This shift contradicted Father Blackwood's claims about thriving missionary communities. Sarah Jenkins, the Abbey's head seamstress, discovered personal items belonging to disappeared families in the community's clothing donation bins. She recognized Mary Brennan's distinctive embroidered shawl and Thomas Henderson's leather work gloves. When questioned, Father Blackwood explained that departing families often donated excess belongings to support the community's charitable work. The disappearances increasingly targeted families who had shown signs of independence or questioning. The Flemings vanished after Patrick Fleming criticized Father Blackwood's prohibition on reading secular newspapers. The Donnelly family disappeared following their eldest son's request to attend university outside the Abbey. Each incident removed potential sources of dissent from the community. Children of disappeared families left no trace in the Abbey school records. Teacher Mary Catherine O'Sullivan noticed that student enrollment numbers failed to reflect the supposed missionary departures. When she raised concerns about class sizes and curriculum planning, Father Blackwood reassured her that new families would soon arrive to maintain proper educational balance. William Murphy, the Abbey's head groundskeeper, observed unusual nocturnal activities around the main building. He frequently saw lights in the basement after midnight and heard sounds of construction or excavation. When questioned about these activities, Father Blackwood explained they were preparing expanded facilities for expected new arrivals. The local sheriff, James Crawford, received his first inquiry about Abbey disappearances in September 1889. A concerned brother in Boston sought information about the McCarthy family who had failed to respond to urgent family correspondence. Sheriff Crawford visited the Abbey and accepted Father Blackwood's explanation about missionary work without investigation. Dr. Winthrop's medical supplies began disappearing from the clinic. Surgical instruments, chloroform and restraining devices vanished without explanation. When confronted, Father Blackwood suggested that departing missionary families required medical equipment for their work in remote locations. The doctor reluctantly accepted this explanation, but began securing sensitive materials. Community members noticed changes in Father Blackwood's behavior during this period. His sermons became more intense, focusing heavily on themes of sacrifice, obedience, and purification through suffering. He spent increasing amounts of time in private prayer and claimed to receive more frequent divine revelations about community members' spiritual needs. The Abbey's financial records showed inconsistencies that puzzled community bookkeepers. Despite regular departures of contributing families, the community's expenses remained stable. Food purchases, clothing needs, and other supplies continued at levels suggesting no population decrease. These anomalies raised questions about actual community size versus recorded departures. Margaret Sullivan organized informal meetings among concerned residents. She documented her observations about the disappearances and shared them with trusted neighbors. However, these meetings ceased abruptly when Margaret herself vanished in November 1889. Father Blackwood announced her calling to join a contemplative order in Canada. Sister Catherine began experiencing nightmares about the disappearance. She saw them calling for help from underground chambers, their voices echoing through the Abbey's basement corridors. When she shared these dreams with Father Blackwood, he prescribed intensive prayer and fasting to purify her mind from worldly attachments and spiritual contamination. The pattern of disappearances established during 1889 would continue for 17 more years. Each incident followed identical procedures: overnight vanishing, divine calling explanations, systematic record alteration, and community acceptance. The signs were there from the beginning, but fear, faith, and Father Blackwood's charismatic authority prevented recognition of the horror unfolding beneath St. Bartholomew's Abbey. Local newspapers never reported the disappearances. The Abbey's positive reputation and Father Blackwood's relationships with influential figures ensured media silence. When family members from outside the community inquired about missing relatives, they received polite letters explaining missionary departures and promises of future communication that never arrived. By December 1889, 12 families totaling 43 individuals had vanished from St. Bartholomew's Abbey. The community continued functioning normally, welcoming new families to replace the departed. Father Blackwood's explanations satisfied most residents, and life proceeded according to established routines. The horror would accelerate dramatically in the coming years, but the pattern of willful blindness had been firmly established. The truth began emerging in March 1906, when construction workers renovating the Abbey's foundation discovered the first chamber. While installing new drainage systems, they broke through what appeared to be a false wall, revealing a carefully constructed underground room measuring approximately 12 feet by 8 feet. Inside, they found human remains arranged in systematic patterns. Foreman Michael O'Connell immediately contacted local authorities. Sheriff James Crawford, now in his final year before retirement, arrived within hours. What he discovered beneath St. Bartholomew's Abbey would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The chamber contained skeletal remains of at least 8 individuals, including several children, arranged in ritualistic positions around a central stone altar. Dr. Samuel Winthrop examined the remains and identified clear evidence of violence. Multiple skulls showed blunt force trauma, while other bones exhibited cut marks consistent with sharp instruments. Several adult skeletons bore restraint marks on wrists and ankles, suggesting prolonged captivity before death. The positioning of remains indicated deliberate arrangement rather than burial. Further excavation revealed an extensive network of underground chambers connected by narrow corridors. The complex extended beneath the entire Abbey structure, with rooms serving different purposes. Some chambers contained restraining devices and surgical instruments. Others held personal belongings catalogued with meticulous detail: clothing, jewelry, letters, and family photos. Workers discovered a chamber filled with glass vials containing human hair samples, each labeled with names, dates, and detailed physical descriptions. Another room housed hundreds of notebooks, filled with psychological observations, behavioral assessments, and experimental records. The documentation revealed systematic study of human subjects over nearly 2 decades. Father Blackwood had vanished 3 days before the discovery. Sister Catherine Morrison found his private quarters empty, with important documents removed and personal belongings gone. His departure appeared planned and deliberate, suggesting advanced knowledge of impending exposure. A search of the surrounding area yielded no trace of his location. Sister Catherine provided crucial testimony about the Abbey's internal operations. Under intensive questioning, she revealed her growing suspicions about the disappearances and Father Blackwood's increasingly erratic behavior. She had maintained detailed records throughout her tenure, believing she was serving God's work, but now recognized her complicity in systematic murder. The recovered notebooks contained Father Blackwood's personal writings detailing his philosophical justification for the killings. He wrote extensively about purification through suffering, divine selection of worthy souls, and his role as God's instrument for separating the faithful from the corrupted. His entries revealed increasing megalomania and complete detachment from moral reality. Dr. Winthrop's testimony provided medical context for the horror. He described Father Blackwood's requests for surgical equipment, chloroform, and restraining devices under the guise of missionary preparation. The doctor admitted his suspicions, but confessed to ignoring warning signs due to the abbot's charismatic authority and his own desire to maintain his prestigious position. Excavation teams discovered evidence of systematic torture and experimentation. One chamber contained detailed anatomical drawings and surgical notes describing procedures performed on living subjects. Another room housed primitive psychological testing equipment and records of behavioral modification attempts. The scope of Father Blackwood's activities exceeded simple serial killing, revealing organized research into human suffering and control. Personal belongings recovered from the chambers allowed identification of many victims. Thomas Henderson's distinctive pocket watch confirmed his death, contradicting Father Blackwood's claims about missionary departure. Mary Brennan's wedding ring and the McCarthy children's toys provided similar verification. The physical evidence demolished the carefully constructed narrative of divine callings. Survivor testimony emerged slowly as community members overcame their fear and shame. Several residents admitted witnessing suspicious activities but remaining silent due to Father Blackwood's threats and their own spiritual conditioning. They described seeing families forcibly removed from their cottages during nighttime hours and hearing screams from beneath the Abbey. The psychological control mechanisms used by Father Blackwood became apparent through survivor accounts. He had systematically isolated community members from outside influences, created dependency through economic control, and used religious authority to suppress questioning. Those who showed signs of independence or skepticism were marked for elimination. Medical examiner Dr. Robert Hayes arrived from Burlington to conduct official autopsies. His preliminary report identified remains of at least 134 individuals, including 47 children. Cause of death varied from blunt force trauma to surgical experimentation, with many victims showing evidence of prolonged torture. The systematic nature of the killings indicated careful planning and execution. Federal investigators arrived in April 1906 under the direction of Agent Theodore Morrison. Their investigation revealed Father Blackwood's fraudulent credentials and criminal history in England. He had been expelled from Canterbury Cathedral for suspected involvement in the disappearance of novice monks. His theological writings were plagiarized from obscure medieval texts. The Abbey's financial records revealed extensive fraud and embezzlement. Father Blackwood had diverted community funds to personal accounts and invested in properties throughout New England under false identities. The missing money totaled over $200,000, equivalent to millions in modern currency. Victim families' personal wealth had been systematically stolen. Investigation into the Abbey's construction revealed hidden architectural features designed to facilitate the underground complex. Father Blackwood had personally supervised installation of secret passages, ventilation systems, and soundproofing materials. The chambers were constructed simultaneously with the main building, indicating premeditated planning for systematic murder. Psychological evaluation of surviving community members revealed widespread trauma and conditioning. Many residents displayed symptoms consistent with prolonged abuse and mind control. They struggled to comprehend the reality of their situation and continued defending Father Blackwood despite overwhelming evidence of his crimes. Recovery would require years of intensive treatment. The discovery attracted national media attention, with newspapers across the country reporting details of the Vermont horror. Journalists descended on Millfield Valley, transforming the quiet rural community into a circus of sensational reporting. The Abbey's previous reputation as a model religious community made the revelations particularly shocking to the American public. Legal proceedings faced immediate complications due to Father Blackwood's disappearance and the complex jurisdiction issues surrounding the Abbey. The community had operated with minimal government oversight, maintaining its own civil records and avoiding official registration of residents. Many victims had no legal existence outside the Abbey's fraudulent documentation. Excavation continued throughout 1906, revealing additional chambers and evidence of even more extensive crimes. The final count reached 201 confirmed victims spanning 17 years of systematic murder. The underground complex contained torture devices, experimental equipment, and detailed records of unspeakable cruelties inflicted upon men, women, and children. The psychological profiles maintained by Father Blackwood revealed his selection criteria for victims. He targeted families showing independence, intelligence, or potential for resistance to his authority. Children were selected based on physical characteristics and intellectual capabilities. The documentation suggested attempts to breed specific traits through forced relationships among survivors. Surviving community members faced intense scrutiny and suspicion from investigators and the public. Many had genuinely believed in Father Blackwood's divine mission and felt profound betrayal upon learning the truth. Others admitted to suspecting criminal activity, but remaining silent due to fear, complicity, or psychological conditioning. Their testimonies provided crucial evidence for understanding the full scope of the horror. The investigation concluded in early 1907, with Father Blackwood's location still unknown. Federal authorities issued nationwide alerts and coordinated with international law enforcement agencies. Despite extensive efforts, no trace of the former abbot was ever found. He had vanished as completely as his victims, leaving behind only the evidence of his monstrous crimes. The federal investigation officially closed in March 1907, without Father Matthias Blackwood ever being apprehended. Despite a nationwide manhunt involving multiple law enforcement agencies, he had vanished as completely as his 201 victims. Agent Theodore Morrison's final report acknowledged the likelihood that Blackwood had escaped to Europe using one of several false identities discovered during the investigation. Local authorities faced immediate pressure to suppress details of the investigation. Vermont Governor Fletcher Proctor received urgent communications from influential figures demanding discretion to protect the state's reputation and prevent panic among religious communities. The scope of the horror threatened to damage public confidence in religious institutions throughout New England. The site cleanup began immediately after investigators completed their work. State authorities hired specialized crews to remove human remains, dismantle the underground complex, and eliminate all physical evidence of the crimes. The official explanation cited public health concerns and the need to restore the property for productive use. Survivor relocation proceeded under strict confidentiality agreements. The 67 remaining Abbey residents were dispersed to various locations throughout New England, with new identities provided to those requesting anonymity. Many struggled with psychological trauma and survivor's guilt, requiring years of treatment in specialized facilities that officially did not exist. Sister Catherine Morrison, Father Blackwood's former deputy, provided the most detailed testimony about the Abbey's internal operations. However, her credibility faced challenges due to her obvious complicity in maintaining the facade that enabled the murders. She died in a Boston sanitarium in 1912, taking many secrets to her grave. The property was sold to a lumber company for immediate development. All buildings were demolished and the land cleared for timber harvesting. The State Forestry Department planted fast-growing pine trees to quickly obscure any remaining evidence of the Abbey's existence. Within 5 years, no visible trace remained of St. Bartholomew's complex. Medical examiner Dr. Robert Hayes faced professional consequences for his thorough documentation of the crimes. His detailed autopsy reports and photographic evidence were classified and sealed. He received unofficial warnings about discussing his findings publicly and eventually relocated to California to escape the controversy surrounding his involvement. Local newspaper coverage ceased abruptly after initial reports. The Millfield Gazette received direct orders from state officials to discontinue coverage, citing ongoing investigation requirements. Editor William Morrison, who had initially praised Father Blackwood's work, destroyed his newspaper archives from 1874 to 1907 and never again mentioned the Abbey in print. Federal agent Theodore Morrison's complete case files disappeared from Department of Justice archives sometime between 1910 and 1915. Official records contained only summary reports with minimal detail about the investigation's findings. Morrison himself transferred to a remote posting in Alaska and rarely discussed his Vermont assignment with colleagues or family. Dr. Samuel Winthrop, the Abbey's physician, faced medical license review for his failure to report suspicious activities. Despite clear evidence of his complicity through willful ignorance, he retained his medical practice after agreeing to never discuss his experiences publicly. He became increasingly reclusive and died from apparent suicide in 1920. The Catholic Church conducted its own internal investigation, but never released findings publicly. Church records from the period were sealed indefinitely, and ecclesiastical authorities refused to acknowledge Father Blackwood's ordination or Abbey authorization. The Church's official position maintained that St. Bartholomew's was an unauthorized religious community operating without proper oversight. Victim families received modest financial settlements in exchange for signed confidentiality agreements. The funds came from seized Abbey assets and did not constitute admission of negligence by any governmental authority. Families who refused the agreements found themselves unable to pursue legal action due to destroyed evidence and missing documentation. Several survivors attempted to publish accounts of their experiences, but faced legal obstacles and publisher reluctance. Margaret Sullivan's sister, who had escaped the Abbey in 1888, wrote a detailed memoir that no publisher would accept. Her manuscript disappeared from her home, and she died under suspicious circumstances later that year. The psychological study of surviving children revealed disturbing patterns of conditioning and abuse. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, who treated many young survivors, documented systematic brainwashing techniques and ritualistic trauma designed to ensure compliance. Her research contributed to early understanding of psychological control methods, but remained classified for decades. Local residents who had interacted with the Abbey faced community suspicion and ostracism. Merchants who had conducted business with Father Blackwood, farmers who had worked Abbey lands, and officials who had visited the community found their reputations permanently damaged. Many relocated to distant communities to escape association with the horror. The Vermont State Police created a special file for reports of Father Blackwood's sightings, which continued for decades after his disappearance. Unconfirmed reports placed him in Canada, Mexico, Europe, and various remote locations throughout the United States. None of these sightings were ever substantiated, but they kept the case technically active until 1957. Property records for the former Abbey site were systematically altered to obscure its history. The land was subdivided multiple times, with ownership transferred through shell companies to prevent identification with the original location. By 1950, no public record connected the property to St. Bartholomew's Abbey or the murders that occurred there, Academic researchers attempting to study the case encountered systematic obstruction. University libraries found their archives incomplete, with crucial documents missing or restricted. Graduate students pursuing related research were discouraged by advisors who cited limited career prospects for scholars associated with such controversial subjects. The psychological impact on law enforcement personnel involved in the investigation proved lasting. Sheriff James Crawford retired immediately after the discovery and never spoke publicly about his experiences. Several other officers involved in the excavation work suffered nervous breakdowns or left law enforcement entirely. The trauma of witnessing such systematic evil proved overwhelming for many. International cooperation in searching for Father Blackwood was hampered by diplomatic sensitivities and institutional embarrassment. British authorities were reluctant to acknowledge their failure to properly investigate his background before his departure for America. Church authorities in Rome refused to provide documentation about his claimed theological training. The specialized workers who had performed the site cleanup were required to sign extensive confidentiality agreements and received generous compensation for their service. Several died under suspicious circumstances within 5 years of completing their work. The foreman, Michael O'Connell, who had first discovered the underground chambers, died in an apparent industrial accident in 19. Medical facilities that had treated Abbey survivors faced pressure to destroy patient records and transfer cases to other institutions. The documentation of victims' psychological conditions and recovery progress was systematically eliminated to prevent future researchers from reconstructing the full scope of Father Blackwood's crimes. By 1920, most participants in the investigation had died, relocated, or been silenced through legal or extra-legal. The few remaining survivors lived under assumed identities and rarely acknowledged their connection to St. Bartholomew's Abbey. The systematic suppression of information had achieved its intended goal of erasing the horror from public memory. Modern attempts to research the case encounter the same obstacles that have protected this secret for over a century. Official records remain sealed or missing, survivor families refuse to discuss their heritage, and the former Abbey site shows no trace of its dark history. The pine forest that now covers the location gives no hint of the underground chambers where 201 souls met their end. The silence surrounding St. Bartholomew's Abbey represents more than simple institutional embarrassment. It reflects the conscious decision by powerful interests to bury evidence of systematic evil that challenged fundamental assumptions about religious authority, community trust, and governmental oversight. That silence continues today, protecting not just reputations but the comfortable illusion that such horrors could not occur in civilized society. Father Matthias Blackwood's ultimate fate remains unknown. He may have lived out his days in comfortable exile, protected by wealth stolen from his victims and the guarantee that authorities would never pursue the truth with sufficient vigor to risk exposure of their own complicity. His legacy persists not in the crimes themselves, but in the successful suppression of justice that followed. The 201 victims of St. Bartholomew's Abbey received no justice, no memorial, and no acknowledgement of their suffering. Their families were paid to forget, their stories were buried with bureaucratic efficiency, and their memory was systematically erased from history. In the end, the cover-up proved more successful than the crimes, ensuring that this particular corner of hell would remain forever hidden beneath the careful silence of institutional power. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths need to be exposed. Leave a comment with the city you're watching from, so we can see how far these forgotten stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.